For today's video, we are in the house talking about something a little different, and that's propagation of a plant that, although it's not human edible, has quite a bit of use on the homestead. Well, as you can see behind me, today we're talking about aquaponics again, but as a lot of our aquaponic videos, or my aquaponic videos are, my crazy experiments, this is not going to, at face value, seem like a particularly valuable video, because what I'm talking about isn't really edible by humans. However, it does have quite the use on the homestead, and keep in mind, at this point in time, we've basically just been experimenting, but the experiments are looking pretty promising. The plant I'm talking about is duckweed, of all things. Duckweed is a small floating plant that has quite the worldwide distribution. As far as I'm aware, this is lesser duckweed, which is the smaller species. There are several species, and right now we are growing this in the top of our guppy tank, which you have seen before. This tank stays basically 19 degrees all winter. We do have to heat it for the guppies, which makes it impractical to scale up to any larger fish in our particular situation. But what's interesting about this duckweed has been growing in here basically since the fall, since we brought it inside. And on average, every 3 days, I can harvest half of a sour cream container's worth of duckweed off the top of this tank. Now, the duckweed serves sort of two main purposes. Purpose one, it grows fastest when it has some nutrients, which means it's taking nutrients out of this tank, which from the perspective of the guppies is a huge positive. The other use for it, and why we collect it every 3 days, I think is by far the more interesting piece, because, so of course, duckweed is used semi-frequently in sort of aquarium husbandry for that very purpose, because it can use a lot of nutrients. But the other thing about duckweed is, depending on what kind of fish or livestock you have, it is edible. And that's the part for me that's very promising here, because this is growing like mad, and we are January, and I can still harvest a half a sour cream container every 3 days and feed it to either our goldfish downstairs, which I'll show you in a moment, or the chickens. So there is the potential to scale this up to be a lot more useful. But I'm going to go ahead, and harvesting is simple. You just scoop off the surface. I have some roots in there, and put it into the container. It's that easy. So there we go. As I say, it's about, and I definitely could have harvested more out of here. One of the challenges, and this is kind of a cramped area to work on, because it's not a very big, it's a big aquarium, but it's got a very small surface area. And you will see, it sticks to your fingers. Well, pardon the glare, there's not much I can do about that from the grow lights, but we are now in the basement, in one of our two sort of goldfish holding tanks. This is to keep a few fish aside in case something goes wrong and we lose any of the ones in the pond, etc. So this is our insurance policy. But it's also an excellent experiment, because as I scan around here, most of this tank, you'll see there's a bit of duckweed, and there's some that's come off my finger because I cleaned what was left on it from upstairs off into the tank. But for the most part, until you get right up around, as you can see kind of, let me point to it, as you can see kind of right here, until you get right up and around the water hyacinth, which the goldfish do not eat, but does still extract nutrients from the water. The goldfish have pretty much eaten everything. These larger goldfish really have a taste for it. Now, when I put it in, this is not the same as feeding pellets where they come right up and eat it, but it's amazing how quickly they do actually come for it. So all I really do is take my container, and since it's a floating plant, I float it out of the jar, out of the container. And I'll do that a couple of times just to get it all completely cleaned out. And as I say, they won't come right up and start eating this immediately, like they would prepared food, but it's amazing how much of this they actually consume. At this point, this probably isn't making a lot of sense. Why we are purposely growing something that's not edible for humans. And although there will be more discussions on the goldfish, even feeding goldfish doesn't seem like something that's maybe all that homestead related. But the principle here is that duckweed, which is a very rapid growth plant, like extremely rapid growth with the right nutrients, is actually very highly nutritious. It's very high in proteins. The interesting part about it, however, is when you're feeding something like goldfish that basically 100% directly adapted to eat it, lives in water all the time and doesn't have too much of a problem ridding its body of water because it's living in that solution, they're getting the benefit out of it because they're basically directly adapted for it. But when you switch to terrestrial animals, what's interesting about it is when they talk about the high content of protein and minerals, they typically speak in terms of dry matter. So if you think of hay, obviously hay, when it's not hay but grass, not dried, also has a lot of water in it. It's very easy to imagine that duckweed, because of the fact that unlike grass, it grows in the water, is extremely high in water content. Now, the level at which we are feeding our chickens, because as you saw, the area we're talking that we can harvest from at this point in time is quite small, isn't a huge deal in the wintertime, because getting liquid and water into your animals in the winter can be a bit more of a challenge than in the summer. So for extremely small scale supplementation, I would say give it a try, because if you've seen some of our other videos on actually raising the fish, if you're raising the fish as part of the food, and you can also raise another food item, which is the duckweed, in the same setup. Now, not this one behind me with the older goldfish, but with the guppies, for instance, it's kind of a win-win because you're doubling up on the production you're getting out of that same space. Now, we haven't done it yet, but we are toying with the idea of upscaling this a little bit, because it's amazing how much the older goldfish eat, your sort of breeding size goldfish actually consume, and the chickens eat it well too. So if we can scale that up during the winter months, that's pretty awesome. So in terms of goldfish, if you're watching this video more from a fish raising perspective, this is evening, and I'm going to come back in 24 and 48 hour intervals, because we usually sort of do a lot of the maintenance on the indoor goldfish right now in the evening, and just sort of see how much of this duckweed disappears, because you can see that little half a container, half a sour cream container, amounted to quite a bit of coverage over the top of this indoor pond. So you'll see this is another pond, the one that was beside it, and these goldfish are about sort of half, well, maybe not half grown, but these are sort of like the juveniles. They're not super young, but they're half the size of the goldfish in the other tank. And while these ones do eat some of the duckweed, it's not as high on their choice of foods at this size as it is on the more adult fish. And you can see there's still quite a bit of duckweed kicking around here on the surface that they haven't bothered to touch. But that's okay, because it still multiplies and still provides a function for them as sort of extra nutrients for extra nutrients use. Okay, well, I've actually been a little bit longer than I said I was going to be, and we're basically 2 days later. But as I scan around here, you can see the goldfish hanging out down the bottom there. You can see that considering we had some pretty major coverage after taking that little half container of, or that little half sour cream container worth out of the guppy tank, they've eaten a lot of it. So this is almost like a snack food, a healthy snack food for goldfish.